Margaret Chen stared at the gaping hole where her $80,000 infinity pool once sparkled in the afternoon sun. The concrete was gone. The filtration system vanished. Even the deck furniture had disappeared without a trace. Behind her, HOA president Linda Whitmore stood frozen, her clipboard trembling in her manicured hands. Finally understanding that her war against excessive pool noise had awakened something far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. Because when you push a structural engineer to her breaking point, you don't just lose a battle, you lose everything you thought. Margaret Chen's fingers drummed against her kitchen counter as she read the HOA violation notice for the third time that morning. The afternoon sun streamed through her floor-to-ceiling windows, casting geometric shadows across the pristine, white marble shadows that should have been dancing with the gentle ripples of her infinity pool just beyond the glass doors. Pool operations creating excessive noise disturbance during quiet hours. She read aloud, her voice tight with controlled frustration. Mandatory hearings scheduled for Tuesday, 7 p.m. The irony wasn't lost on her. As a structural engineer who'd spent 15 years designing acoustic solutions for high-rise buildings, Margaret knew exactly how much sound her pool's circulation system generated, roughly 42 decibels at the property line, quieter than a library, quieter than most people's central air conditioning. She'd moved to Willowbrook Estates precisely because the HOA bylaws promised reasonable accommodation for quality-of-life amenities. The $80,000 infinity pool had been her dream a reward. For surviving the divorce, for rebuilding her life from scratch, for finally having a place where her teenage daughter, Emma, could feel at home. The sound of Emma's Honda Civic pulling into the driveway interrupted her thoughts. Margaret watched through the window as her 16-year-old daughter emerged from the car, shoulders hunched with the familiar weight of another difficult day at her new school. The pool had been Emma's sanctuary these past few months, the one place where she'd started to smile again. "Mom," Emma called out, sliding the patio door open, "why does Mrs. Whitmore keep walking back and forth in front of our house? She's got that clipboard thing again." Margaret followed Emma's gaze to the sidewalk, where Linda Whitmore paced like a general surveying a battlefield. Even from this distance, Margaret could see the rigid set of Linda's shoulders, the way her perfectly styled blonde hair caught the light as she made notes on her ever-present clipboard. "She's documenting evidence," Margaret said, the words leaving a bitter taste in her mouth. "Evidence of what?" "The pool is barely making any noise. That's exactly the problem." Emma frowned. "That doesn't make sense." Margaret had been thinking the same thing for weeks. Linda's complaints had started the day after the pool installation was completed. First, it was the excessive splashing during Emma's evening swims. Then it was the mechanical noise from the filtration system. Most recently, Linda had filed a formal complaint about the disturbing absence of natural neighborhood sounds being masked by artificial water features, too loud, then to quiet. It was as if Linda was determined to find fault no matter what. "She's been HOA president for 12 years, Margaret explained, watching Linda measure the distance between the pool and the property line with a yellow tape measure. "This is her kingdom, and she doesn't like changes she didn't approve." "But you got approval." "I saw all the paperwork. I got approval from the Architectural Review Board." Linda wasn't on the board when they voted. Emma's eyes widened with understanding. "So she's mad because she couldn't stop it." "Something like that?" The doorbell rang, its chimes echoing through the house with an ominous weight. Margaret knew who it was before she opened the door. Linda Whitmore stood on the front porch, her clipboard clutched against her chest like armor. At 52, she was the kind of woman who'd clearly been beautiful once and was now fighting that fading with an arsenal of expensive treatments and designer clothes. Her smile was perfectly calibrated, warm enough to seem friendly, cold enough to establish dominance. "Margaret, darling," Linda said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "I hope you received my notice about Tuesday's hearing." "I did, though I'm not sure what there is to discuss. The pool meets all HOA specifications." Linda's smile tightened. "Oh, honey, it's not about specifications. It's about being a considerate neighbor. You know, community standards." "Community standards. The Hendersons next door have been complaining about the noise. Poor Eleanor can't sleep with all that water bubbling away at night." Margaret felt her jaw clench. The Hendersons lived in the house to the left of hers, a good 50 feet from the pool. Their bedroom faced the opposite direction. Linda, the pool's circulation system runs at 42 decibels. That's quieter than most refrigerators. Well, it's not just the mechanical noise, is it? It's the whole ... atmosphere. Linda gestured vaguely at the pool area. All that splashing and ... water sounds. It's very disruptive to the natural ambiance of the neighborhood. The natural ambiance? We've worked very hard to maintain a certain character here in Willowbrook, peaceful, harmonious. Your pool is. Well, it's rather ostentatious, don't you think? Margaret felt the familiar heat rising in her chest, the same feeling she'd had during her divorce proceedings, when her ex-lawyer had tried to paint her as an unfit mother simply because she worked long hours. The feeling of being attacked for refusing to apologize for her success. Linda, I followed every rule. I submitted plans, got approval, hired licensed contractors. The pool is set back 30 feet from the property line, which is 10 feet more than required. I even installed additional landscaping to provide visual screening. Yes, but did you consider the cumulative impact on neighborhood tranquility? Margaret stared at her. The cumulative impact. The psychological effect of artificial water features on community well-being. The way constant water sounds can mask important environmental cues. Birds, wind, the natural rhythm of suburban life. You're upset because my pool is too quiet? Linda's composure cracked slightly. I'm concerned about maintaining the standards that make Willowbrook special, standards that protect everyone's property values and quality of life. My pool increases. Property values, perhaps. But at what cost to community cohesion? Margaret could feel Emma watching from the kitchen doorway, could see the tension in her daughter's shoulders. This was supposed to be their fresh start, their chance to build something positive after 2 years of upheaval. Linda, what do you want? I want you to be reasonable. Perhaps we can find a compromise, maybe limiting pool hours, or installing additional sound barriers. The pool already meets every noise ordinance in the city. The HOA has broader authority than city ordinances. Dear, we have the right to maintain community standards that go beyond minimum legal requirements. Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. What exactly are you proposing? Linda's smile returned, sharper now. Come to Tuesday's hearing. We'll discuss options, such as, well, removal is always an option. If the pool proves incompatible with neighborhood harmony, the words hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret felt her engineer's mind kicking into gear, analyzing the structural implications of what Linda was suggesting. The pool wasn't just a luxury feature, it was integrated into the property's drainage system, connected to the main water line, anchored into the foundation with steel reinforcement. Removing it would require, you can't force me to remove my pool. I can't force you to do anything, Margaret, but the HOA has certain tools at its disposal. Fines, liens, legal action. Sometimes it's easier to work together than to fight. Is that a threat? Linda's eyes glittered. It's a reality check. This is a community, not a kingdom. You can't just do whatever you want without considering the impact on others. Margaret stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. Linda, I've been nothing but considerate. I followed every rule, respected every boundary, but I will not be bullied into removing something I built legally on my own property. We'll see about that. Linda turned to go, then paused. Ooh, and Margaret, you might want to check your property survey. I've been reviewing the original plat maps, and I think there might be some discrepancies in the setback measurements. Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her feet. What discrepancies? Nothing major, just a few inches here and there. But the HOA takes property line violations very seriously. As Linda walked away, Margaret's mind raced through the construction documents. She'd supervised the survey herself, had the pool positioned exactly 30 feet from the property line. There was no way, unless Linda was planning to manufacture evidence. Margaret closed the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding. Through the kitchen window, she could see Emma standing at the pool's edge, her reflection wavering in the water. This was supposed to be their sanctuary, their new beginning. Instead, it was becoming a battleground, and Margaret Chen, structural engineer and survivor of one too many battles, was about to discover that some wars aren't won with rules and regulations. Sometimes you had to rebuild the battlefield itself. Tuesday was 3 days away. That gave her 72 hours to prepare. She reached for her pee. The Willowbrook Estates Community Center had never felt smaller. Margaret sat in the second row of folding chairs, her leather portfolio balanced on her knees, watching Linda Whitmore transform into a prosecutor. The HOA president had traded her usual pastel cardigan for a navy blazer that made her look like she was running for city council. Her clipboard had been replaced by a thick manila folder stuffed with what looked like evidence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," Linda began, glanced around the room. 12 residents had shown up, a decent turnout for a Tuesday evening. The Patels, who'd always been friendly, David Kim from the corner house, who'd actually complimented her pool installation, sat beside her, fidgeting with her phone. Margaret had debated bringing her daughter, but Emma had insisted. "If they're going to attack our home, I want to be there," she'd said. The determination in her voice had reminded Margaret of herself. At that age, stubborn, protective, unwilling to back down from a fight. The pool in question, Linda continued, clicking to a slideshow projected on the community center's wall, was installed without proper consideration for neighborhood impact. While the homeowner may have followed the letter of the law, she ignored the spirit of community cooperation. The first slide showed Margaret's backyard from an aerial view clearly taken with a drone, which Margaret was pretty sure violated several privacy laws. The pool looked massive from this angle, dominating the landscape like a blue scar. As you can see, Linda said, laser pointer dancing across the projection. The installation has fundamentally altered the character of this section of Willowbrook. The natural flow of the landscape has been disrupted. The mature oak tree that provided habitat for local wildlife has been removed. Margaret felt her jaw tighten. The oak tree had been dying, infected with a fungal disease that would have killed it within 2 years. The arborist's report was in her portfolio, along with the city permit for its removal. More concerning, Linda continued, is the noise impact. While the homeowner claims the pool operates at acceptable decibel levels, noise pollution isn't just about volume, it's about frequency, duration, and the cumulative effect on community well-being. The next slide showed a graph with fluctuating lines in red and blue. Margaret squinted at it, trying to make sense of the data. It looked professional enough, but something about the measurements seemed off. "The Hendersons have documented sleep disruption," Linda said, nodding toward the elderly couple in the front row. "Mrs. Henderson's sleep tracker shows a 40% decrease in REM sleep since the pool installation." Made a note in her portfolio, the Hendersons' bedroom faced east, away from her pool. Their house was also equipped with central air conditioning that ran significantly louder than her pool's circulation system. "But the most serious issue," Linda said, her voice dropping to a grave whisper, "is the property line violation." Margaret's blood ran cold. The slide changed to show a surveyor's diagram of her backyard, with measurements marked in red ink. According to the diagram, her pool was only 26 feet from the property line, 4 feet closer than the required 30-foot setback. A recent survey commissioned by the HOA shows clear encroachment into the required setback zone, Linda announced. "This is not just a violation of our community standards, it's a violation of county zoning laws." The room erupted in murmurs. Margaret felt Emma's hand grab her arm, felt the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes turning toward her. This was exactly what she'd been afraid of. Linda had manufactured evidence. "Ms. Chen," said board member Robert Santos, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who'd always seemed reasonable, "do you have any response to these findings?" Margaret stood, her portfolio clutched against her chest. "I do. First, I'd like to know who conducted this survey and when it was performed." Linda's smile was razor-sharp. "Hartwell and Associates. They're a licensed surveying firm with 30 years of experience. The survey was conducted last Friday. Without my permission or knowledge, the survey was conducted from public property and adjacent lots with owner consent. Perfectly legal. I'd like to see the actual survey documents, not just this diagram, of course." Linda handed her a thick folder. "Everything's properly documented." Margaret flipped through the pages, her engineer's eye scanning the technical details. The survey looked legitimate, professional letterhead, proper documentation, certified measurements. But something nagged at her. The reference points seemed off, the methodology unclear. "This survey contradicts the original construction survey," Margaret said, "the one filed with the county and approved by the Architectural Review Board." "Survey technology has improved significantly in recent years," Linda replied smoothly. GPS-based measurements are far more accurate than the chain-in-transit methods used in older surveys. The original survey was conducted with GPS equipment, perhaps, but Hartwell & Associates uses military-grade precision instruments. Their margin of error is less than 2 inches. Margaret felt the room's attention shifting. Linda was winning, painting her as someone who'd either made a mistake or deliberately tried to circumvent the rules. The narrative was simple and effective. Wealthy newcomer builds oversized pool, disturbs neighbors, violates property lines, then argues with technical details when caught. "I'd like to request an independent survey," Margaret said. "The HOA has presented credible evidence of violation. You can commission your own survey. But until then, the pool is in violation of both HOA rules and county zoning." "What does that mean exactly?" Board member Sandra Walsh, a woman in her 60s who'd been taking notes throughout the presentation, looked up from her clipboard. "It means the pool must be brought into compliance or removed." "And how do you propose I move a pool for feet?" "It must be corrected." Margaret felt the walls closing in. She'd been outmaneuvered, caught off guard by Linda's willingness to manufacture evidence, but as she looked at the survey documents again, something clicked in her engineer's mind. The reference points, the measurement methodology, the GPS coordinates, there was something fundamentally wrong with the data. "I need time to review these documents properly," Margaret said. "The board will reconvene. In 2 weeks, that should give you sufficient time to explore your options. And in the meantime, the pool remains in violation. We'll need to begin the process of issuing daily fines until the situation is resolved." Daily fines, $500 per day, as specified in the HOA bylaws. The fines will be placed as a lien against the property if not paid within 30 days. Margaret did the math quickly. $7,000 per week. At that rate, she'd be financially ruined within a month. "This is insane," Emma said, standing up beside her mother. "You can't just make up fake measurements." "And Emma," Margaret said quietly, but her daughter was already moving. "No, Mom, this is bullshit. Mrs. Whitmore, you've been harassing us since the day we moved in. First the pool was too loud, then it was too quiet. Now suddenly it's 4 feet closer to the property line than it was 6 months ago. How does that work?" Linda's composure cracked slightly. "Young lady, I understand you're upset, but I'm not upset. I'm angry. This is our home. And you're trying to destroy it because you're mad you couldn't stop us in the first place." The room fell silent. Margaret felt a surge of pride mixed with panic. Emma was right, but attacking Linda directly would only make things worse. "Emma," Margaret said gently, "let's go home. We have work to do." As they gathered their things, Margaret caught Mrs. Garcia's eye. The elderly woman mouthed something that looked like, "Call me." Outside, the evening air was thick with summer heat. Margaret's hands were shaking as she unlocked her car, the weight of the situation finally hitting her. $14,000 in fines by next week. "Are we?" Margaret stared at the road ahead, her mind racing through possibilities. She'd built her career on solving impossible structural problems, on finding solutions when everyone else saw only obstacles. Linda Whitmore had just made the mistake of treating her like a typical suburban homeowner instead of a professional. "Engineer, no," Margaret said quietly. "We're not going to let her win. What are we going to do?" Margaret pulled into their driveway and looked at the house they'd worked so hard to make into a home. The pool sparkled in the evening light, surrounded by the carefully planned landscaping that had cost Margaret was already in her home office at 5:30 a.m., surrounded by blueprints, county records, and 3 cups of coffee. The surveyor's report from Linda's presentation lay spread across her desk like evidence at a crime scene. She'd been up most of the night, and what she'd found made her blood run cold, not because of what the survey showed, but because of what it didn't show. The sound of heavy trucks rumbling down Willowbrook Lane made her look up from her laptop. Through the window, she could see Jim's crew arriving, a backhoe, a concrete saw, and a truck loaded with what looked like demolition equipment. Several neighbors had come out to watch, including Linda Whitmore, who stood on her front porch in a silk robe, her face a mask of smug satisfaction. Mom Emma appeared in the doorway, still in her pajamas. "There are like 6 trucks outside. What's happening?" Research, Margaret said, not looking up from her screen, and the beginning of the end of Linda Whitmore's little game. She'd spent the night diving deep into county records, historical surveys, and property deeds. What she'd found was a pattern of discrepancies that went back decades, not just with her property, but with Linda's as well. The original subdivision plat from 1987 told a very different story than the one Linda had presented to the HOA board. Phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Garcia. "Can you come over? Need to show you something important?" Margaret looked at Emma. "I need to go next door for a few minutes. Jim's crew is going to start some exploratory work around the pool. If anyone asks, tell them it's a routine inspection." "What kind of inspection? The kind that's going to save our home?" Mrs. Garcia's house was a mirror image of Margaret's, but 50 years of careful maintenance had given it a warmth that Margaret's modern renovations couldn't quite match. The elderly woman met her at the door, her usually cheerful expression replaced by something closer to anger. "Margaret, dear, come in. I've been waiting for someone to stand up to that woman for years." She led Margaret to her dining room, where yellowed documents were spread across the mahogany table. "I've been living here for 37 years. I was here when they built Linda's house, when they installed her pool, when she expanded her deck 3 times without permits." Margaret's eyes widened. Linda has a pool. She had it filled in about 8 years ago, when she decided it was too much maintenance. But here's the thing. Mrs. Garcia pointed to a faded blueprint. When they built it in 1995, it was only 22 feet from the property line, 6 feet closer than yours. Margaret felt her heart racing. "Do you have documentation?" "Better than that, I have photographs." Mrs. Garcia opened a photo album, pages filled with neighborhood pictures spanning decades. "Here's Linda's pool installation. Here's the property survey they did. And here," she pointed to a measurement stake visible in one photo. "You can see the markers they used." Margaret studied the photos, her engineer's eye picking up details that would have been invisible to most people. The reference points, the measurement methodology, the relationship between Linda's pool and the property boundaries, it all painted a picture of breathtaking hypocrisy. "Mrs. Garcia, would you be willing to testify about this?" "Honey, I've been waiting 37 years for someone to call that woman out. She's been the neighborhood bully since the day she moved in. Your pool is just the latest excuse." Margaret's phone rang. Jim's voice was tight with concern. "Margaret, you need to get back here. We've got a problem." She found the construction crew gathered around the pool's edge, their faces grim. Jim pointed to a section of concrete they'd exposed near the pool's foundation. "Margaret, this isn't right. Look at these measurements." She knelt beside the excavation, studying the exposed foundation markers. Each one was stamped with GPS coordinates and survey references. But when she compared them to Linda's survey report, the discrepancies were glaring. "Jim, these coordinates don't match the survey from last Friday." "That's not the worst part." He handed her a metal detector. "We found these buried about 6 inches down, right along the property line." Margaret looked at the metal objects in his palm. Survey stakes, old ones, with different markings than the ones currently in place. Her blood ran cold as she realized what she was looking at. Someone moved the property markers. That's what it looks like. The GPS coordinates on these old stakes match your original survey exactly, but the ones in place now are about 4 feet off. Margaret felt the pieces clicking together. Linda hadn't just commissioned a fraudulent survey, she'd physically altered the property boundaries to make the survey appear legitimate. It was a level of deception that bordered on criminal. "Jim, I need you to document everything. Photos, measurements, GPS coordinates, and I need you to do it quickly. What's the rush?" Margaret pointed across the yard, where Linda Whitmore was walking toward them with 2 men in suits. "Because our HOA president is about to try to stop us." Linda's voice carried across the yard. Before she'd even reached them, "Excuse me, this is private property, and you don't have permission to be excavating here." Margaret stood, brushing dirt from her knees. "Actually, Linda, this is my private property, and I have every right to inspect my own foundation, not when you're in violation of county zoning laws. The HOA has filed an injunction to prevent any further construction until the property line issue is resolved." One of the men in suits stepped forward. "Ms. Chen, I'm David Walsh from Walsh & Associates. We represent the Willowbrook Estates HOA. You're ordered to cease all excavation activities immediately." Margaret looked at the legal documents he handed her. The injunction was real, filed that morning with the county court. Linda had moved fast, trying to prevent exactly the kind of investigation Margaret was conducting. "This is interesting timing," Margaret said, not moving from her position beside the excavation. "Filing an injunction just as I'm discovering evidence that contradicts your survey." Linda's composure flickered. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I'm talking about these." Margaret held up the old survey stakes, found buried 6 inches down, right along the property line, with GPS coordinates that don't match your new survey. The lawyer stepped forward. "Ms. Chen, I need to advise you that continuing this excavation in defiance of a court order could result in serious legal consequences. And I need to advise you that tampering with property boundaries is a felony." Linda's face went pale. "That's a serious accusation. It's about to become a serious legal problem." Margaret turned to Jim. "Call the county surveyor's office. Tell them we need an emergency investigation of possible boundary fraud." "You can't do that," Linda said, her voice rising. "Actually, I can, and I just did." Margaret pulled out her phone and dialed. "Sheriff's Department. A need to report suspected property fraud and evidence tampering." The next hour was a blur of activity. The county surveyor arrived first, followed by 2 sheriff's deputies who took statements and photographed the excavation site. Linda stood to one side, her lawyer whispering urgently in her ear while she watched her carefully constructed case crumble. "Ms. Chen," said Deputy Martinez, a young woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, "can you walk me through what you found?" Margaret led her to the excavation site, pointing out the discrepancies between the old and new survey markers. "The original stakes show my pool is exactly 30 feet from the property line, but someone moved the markers to make it appear I was in violation, and you suspect Ms. Whitmore." "I suspect someone with access to surveying equipment and detailed knowledge of property boundaries. Someone who knew exactly how to make a fraudulent survey look legitimate." Deputy Martinez made notes in her report. "We'll need to have the county surveyor verify these measurements. In the meantime, the court injunction is still in effect. But now that we have evidence of fraud, now we have evidence of possible fraud. The legal process will take time." Margaret felt frustration building. Even with proof of Linda's deception, the wheels of justice moved slowly, and every day that passed meant more fines, more legal fees, more pressure to simply give up and remove the pool. But as she watched Linda's lawyer hurry her away from the scene, Margaret realized something important. Linda wasn't just angry anymore, she was scared. Scared enough to file emergency injunctions, scared enough to bring lawyers, scared enough to risk everything on a desperate gamble. "What do you mean?" Margaret smiled, the first genuine smile she'd felt in days. "I mean, Linda Whitmore just made a critical error. She showed me exactly how afraid she is of what we might find, and that tells me we're not just dealing with a fraudulent survey." She looked at her house, at the pool that had caused so much trouble, at the neighborhood that was supposed to be their sanctuary. Linda had declared war over a pool that met every regulation and exceeded every standard. But war was a dangerous game, especially when you were fighting someone who understood the ground beneath your feet better than you did. "Pack up the heavy equipment," Margaret told Jim. "We're going to need it somewhere else." Where Margaret's smile turned predatory. "Linda Whitmore's backyard, because if she's willing to commit fraud to hide something about my property, I want to know what she's hiding about her own." The county surveyor's report arrived at 6:47 a.m. on Thursday morning, delivered by a somber-faced clerk who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Margaret signed for it with trembling hands, already knowing what she'd find, but needing to see it in black and white. "Property boundary fraud confirmed," she read aloud to Emma over breakfast. "Original survey markers deliberately relocated. Estimated date of tampering within the past 2 weeks." Emma nearly choked on her cereal. 2 weeks. Fight. So she decided to manufacture one. The rest of the report was damning. The county surveyor had used ground-penetrating radar to map the original property boundaries. Plat. Not only was Margaret's pool perfectly legal, but Linda's property showed evidence of multiple unauthorized structures built over the decades. Margaret's phone rang. Jim's voice was tight with excitement. "Margaret, you need to get over here. We found something." She found him standing in Linda's backyard, which should have been impossible. The property was surrounded by a 6-foot privacy fence, and Linda had explicitly forbidden any access. But Jim was there with 2 other men, all wearing official-looking hard hats and carrying surveying equipment. "How did you?" "County warrant," Jim said, holding up a legal document. Once they confirmed the boundary fraud, the judge authorized a full investigation of all properties involved. "We have legal access to survey Linda's entire lot." Margaret felt a surge of satisfaction. Linda's own fraudulent survey had triggered the very investigation that would expose her secrets. "What did you find?" Jim led her to the center of the yard, where a rectangular patch of grass looked newer than the rest. "Remember how Mrs. Garcia said Linda filled in her pool about 8 years ago? Well, she didn't just fill it in, she built over it." Margaret stared at the ground, her engineer's mind automatically calculating load-bearing capacities and structural integrity. "The ground-penetrating radar shows a massive concrete structure about 12 feet down, way bigger than a pool, and it's not on any of the original building permits." "How big?" 40 feet by 60 feet. Concrete reinforcement and specialized waterproofing. It was the kind of project that would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and require multiple permits from the county. "Jim, I need you to start digging." "Already on it. The excavator should be here in an hour." As if summoned by their conversation, Linda Whitmore appeared at her back door. She looked haggard, as if she hadn't slept in days. Her usual perfect appearance was replaced by hastily applied makeup and a wrinkled blouse. "Get off my property," she screamed across the yard. "I don't care what warrant you have. This is harassment." Deputy Martinez, who'd been standing quietly near the fence, stepped forward. "You're welcome to contact your attorney." "I already have. This is a legal search and seizure." "No, ma'am. This is a fraud investigation. We have probable cause to believe you've committed multiple violations of county zoning laws." Linda's face went white. "I don't know what you're talking about." Margaret walked closer to the fence. "Linda, what's buried under your backyard?" "Nothing. There's nothing buried there." "Then you won't mind if we dig it up." Linda's composure finally cracked completely. "Your money had to prove you were better than everyone else. This isn't about the pool anymore, Linda. This is about you committing fraud to cover up whatever you're hiding." "I'm not hiding anything." Margaret had spent enough time dealing with contractors and city officials to recognize the sound of someone lying badly. Margaret recognized most of them the same people who'd sat silently while Linda railroaded her at the HOA meeting. Margaret, Mrs. Garcia, appeared at her elbow. "I've been thinking about what you found, about Linda's old pool. I remember when they filled it in. It was right after the Hendersons moved in next door. Linda said it was too much maintenance, but I always thought it was strange." Margaret felt a chill. "What happened right before they filled it in?" "There was some kind of accident." "Truck?" "I don't know, but it was big, industrial looking, and it left in a hurry." Whatever Linda had buried, it was substantial enough to require professional construction equipment. "Mrs. Garcia, do you remember the exact date?" Margaret pulled out her phone and started searching county records, building permits, inspections, any official documentation from that time period. What she found made her blood run cold. "Jim," she called out, "stop digging, excavator," and climbed down from the cab. "What's wrong?" "I need to call the FBI." "The FBI?" "Margaret." "What?" "August 15th, 2017. That's the same day the Riverside Chemical Plant reported a missing shipment of industrial waste. 12 barrels of benzene-contaminated sludge that were supposed to be delivered to a hazardous waste facility." Jim stared at her. "You think Linda?" "I think Linda accepted an illegal waste disposal contract. Ms. Chen did." "You say hazardous waste, potentially?" "I need to contact the EPA and the FBI Environmental Crimes Unit. If there are chemical barrels buried under there, we could be looking at groundwater contamination, soil toxicity, and public health violations." It was too late. The excavator had already exposed the top of a concrete vault, and through a crack in the surface, Margaret could see the edge of what looked like a metal drum. "Everyone back!" Deputy Martinez shouted. "This is now a hazmat situation." The next few hours were a blur of emergency vehicles, hazmat teams, and federal agents. Margaret found herself giving statements to EPA investigators, FBI environmental crime specialists, and county prosecutors. The scope of Linda's deception was staggering. 12 barrels of benzene sludge, Agent Sarah Kim explained as they watched hazmat specialists carefully extract the first drum. Street value of illegal disposal, about $50,000. Cost of proper disposal, $300,000. Ms. Whitmore took the money and figured no one would ever find out because your pool installation required extensive excavation near the property line. If you dug 6 feet deeper, or if your drainage system had extended toward her property, she couldn't risk that. Margaret felt sick, so she fabricated the entire property dispute to force me to remove the pool. She fabricated the dispute, moved boundary markers, and filed fraudulent HOA complaints. Crime. As the sun set, Margaret stood in her backyard, looking at her pristine pool. The water sparkled in the evening light, perfectly clean and safe. 50 feet away, hazmat specialists were extracting barrel after barrel of toxic waste from Linda Whitmore's buried vault. Emma joined her at the pool's edge. "Mom, is it over?" Margaret watched Linda being led away in handcuffs, her perfect HOA president facade finally stripped away to reveal the criminal beneath. The woman who'd called Margaret's pool to quiet was now facing federal charges for environmental crimes, fraud, and public endangerment. "It's over," Margaret said, but Linda was right about one thing. "What's that?" Margaret smiled as she watched the FBI agents carry away the last of the evidence. "The neighborhood is definitely going to be a lot quieter now." To be continued. 6 months later, Margaret Chen stood in her backyard watching Emma and 3 of her new friends from school splash in the pool that had caused so much trouble. The winter air was crisp, but the heated pool sent gentle clouds of steam into the evening sky. The sound of laughter and splashing water filled the air sounds that were no longer too loud, too quiet, or anything other than perfect. The Willowbrook Estates Community Center was packed for the emergency HOA meeting, but this time, Margaret was the one standing at the podium. The board had asked her to serve as interim president after Linda's arrest, and she'd reluctantly agreed. Someone had to clean up the mess Linda had left behind. "The environmental remediation is finally complete," Margaret announced to the crowd of residents. "The EPA has confirmed that Linda Whitmore's illegal waste disposal operation has been fully contained. There was minimal groundwater contamination, and it's been successfully cleaned up." A murmur of relief swept through the room. For months, residents had lived in fear that their own properties might be contaminated, their property values destroyed by their former HOA president's crimes. "The legal settlements have also been finalized," Margaret continued. "The chemical company that paid Whitmore for illegal disposal has agreed to compensate all residents for property value impacts, legal fees, and environmental testing. Each household will receive a check for $50,000. This time the murmur was much louder. Robert Santos, the former board member, raised his hand. "What about Whitmore herself?" Linda Whitmore was sentenced last week to 8 years in federal prison for environmental crimes, fraud, and conspiracy. She's also been ordered to pay $2.3 million in restitution, though most of that will go to the EPA for cleanup costs. Margaret didn't mention that Linda's assets had been frozen, her house foreclosed, and her retirement account seized. The woman who'd once ruled Willowbrook Estates, like a petty tyrant, was now serving time in a minimum security federal facility. Sharing a cell with a woman convicted of tax evasion, the question now, Margaret said, is how we move forward as a community. She looked out at the faces of her neighbors, people who'd watched Linda's harassment campaign in silence, who'd let fear and social pressure override their better judgment. Some looked ashamed. Others seemed relieved. A few, like Mrs. Garcia, looked proud. "I've spent the last 6 months reviewing our HOA bylaws and enforcement procedures," Margaret continued. "What I found was a system designed to concentrate power in the hands of one person with very few checks and balances. That's how someone like Linda Whitmore was able to abuse her position for 12 years. She clicked to the next slide in her presentation. "I'm proposing a complete overhaul of our governance structure, term limits for board positions, mandatory community input on all enforcement actions, independent arbitration for disputes, and most importantly, transparency in all board decisions." Eleanor Henderson, who'd been one of Linda's most vocal supporters during the pool dispute, stood up shakily. "Margaret, I owe you an apology. We all do. We let Linda convince us that you were the problem when she was the one destroying our neighborhood. Margaret felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she'd had during her divorce, when former friends had chosen sides based on gossip rather than truth. But this time, instead of anger, she felt something closer to pity. Mrs. Henderson, Linda, was very good at manipulating people. She used fear and conformity to maintain control. "We all fell for it to some degree, but you didn't," said David, Kim, from the corner house. "You fought back when the rest of us were too scared. I fought back because I had to, but I also had advantages: professional knowledge, financial resources, the ability to hire lawyers and experts. Not everyone has those advantages." Margaret clicked to her final slide. "That's why I'm proposing the creation of a community defense fund. Any resident facing HOA enforcement action will have access to independent legal counsel and technical expertise. No one should have to face a Linda Whitmore alone." The vote was unanimous. For the first time in Willowbrook Estates history, the HOA would serve as a protection for residents rather than a weapon against them. After the meeting, Margaret walked home through the quiet streets. Most of the houses were dark, their owners settled in for the evening. Linda's former house stood empty, a for sale sign on the lawn that had been there for months. The asking price had dropped 3 times, but buyers were understandably wary of purchasing a property that had been the center of a federal environmental investigation. Emma was waiting in the kitchen when Margaret got home, homework spread across the dining table. "How did the meeting go?" Emma asked, not looking up from her chemistry textbook. "Better than expected. The new bylaws passed, and we have a real community now instead of Linda's personal kingdom. Good, Mrs. Garcia called. She wants to know if we're still planning the neighborhood barbecue for next weekend." Margaret smiled. The barbecue had been Mrs. Garcia's idea, way to bring the community together after months of division and suspicion. What had started as a small gathering had grown into a block party with over 40 families participating. Tell her yes and ask if she needs help with the planning. Emma looked up from her homework. "Mom, do you ever regret it? Fighting Linda? I mean, everything we went through?" Margaret considered the question seriously. The legal fees, the stress, the months of uncertainty had been the hardest thing she'd done since her divorce. But as she looked out at the pool, at the home they'd built together, at the community they were helping to heal, she knew the answer. No, because if I hadn't fought, Linda would still be out there, bullying the next family who didn't fit her idea of neighborhood perfection. Sometimes you have to stand up to people like that, even when it's scary. What if she comes back when she gets out of prison? Margaret had wondered the same thing. 8 years wasn't forever, and Linda was only 52. She'd eventually be released, and she'd need somewhere to live. "She won't come back here," Margaret said. "Her house will be sold to cover her legal debts. And even if she wanted to return, the new HOA bylaws include provisions preventing anyone with a criminal record from serving in leadership positions or filing frivolous complaints. So we're safe, and more than that, we're free." Later that evening, Margaret stood by the pool, listening to the gentle hum of the circulation system. 42 decibels, just as she'd calculated, quieter than a library, quieter than most air conditioners, quieter than the sound of fear that had once dominated this neighborhood. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jim. "Saw the news about the HOA meeting. Proud of you." Also, got a call from a developer in Riverside. Seems they have an HOA president who's been harassing residents about their landscaping choices. "Interested in consulting on a community governance overhaul?" Margaret smiled and typed back. "Send me the details. Sounds like they need an engineer." As she put her phone away, Margaret realized that Linda Whitmore had given her something unexpected, a new purpose. Her career had been built on solving structural problems, on engineering solutions to complex challenges. But the most important structure she'd ever worked on wasn't made of concrete and steel, it was made of people, relationships, and the fragile trust that held communities together. The pool's underwater lights cast dancing patterns on the surrounding deck, peaceful and constant. Emma's friends would be back tomorrow after school, and the sound of their laughter would fill the air. Mrs. Garcia would drop by with homemade cookies. David Kim would wave from his yard while walking his dog. It was exactly what Margaret had dreamed of when she'd first moved to Willowbrook Estates, a community where families could build their lives without fear, where children could play without harassment, where the only sound from the pool was the sound of happiness. Linda Whitmore had been wrong about many things, but she'd been right about one. The pool had changed the neighborhood forever, just not in the way she'd intended. The water was finally, perfectly, blissfully quiet, and that silence was the sound of justice.